It was just another quiet afternoon in the suburbs, or so it seemed. Mary Johnson, a 65-year-old black woman, had just left her small but cozy apartment in the heart of downtown to take her usual stroll through the neighborhood. The sun was starting to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the sidewalk. For Mary, it was her time to reflect on the day, think about her family, and enjoy a bit of peace. But what was about to happen would shatter that peace and spark a series of events that no one could have predicted. As Mary walked down the street, humming softly to herself, she noticed two police officers in their squad car parked nearby. They were chatting, seemingly relaxed. But Mary couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her senses were sharp, especially after all she had witnessed in her years. Years of racial injustice, of seeing her community mistreated by those who were meant to protect them. She had lived through enough of it to know when things were about to go sideways. And sideways they went. Without warning, one of the officers stepped out of the car and approached Mary. "Ma'am, I need to see your ID," he demanded, his tone cold and authoritative. Mary stopped in her tracks, confusion flickering in her eyes. "My ID? Why?" "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice calm but firm. The officer's eyes narrowed. "Don't question me. Just give it to me." Mary felt a twinge of fear, but she didn't let it show. She had lived through too many hard times to let herself be intimidated now. She reached into her purse slowly, trying to remain composed. But just as her fingers brushed the edge of her wallet, the other officer, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. His hands were quick, grabbing her arm in a rough motion. Mary stumbled back, almost losing her balance. "Hey, let go of me," she protested, trying to pull her arm free. The officers were now yelling at her, their voices rising with every passing second. "You're under arrest," one of them shouted, his grip tightening around her arm. "For what?" Mary's heart began to race. She couldn't understand why this was happening. She hadn't done a thing wrong. "You think you're above the law?" the officer barked, pushing her roughly against the side of the squad car. And then it happened. Without any warning, the first officer shoved Mary violently, sending her crashing to the pavement. Her head hit the concrete hard. The world around her spun as the pain surged through her body, but she refused to let herself show weakness. She wasn't going to cry out, not for them, not for anyone. The second officer stood over her, eyes filled with contempt. "Stay down," he sneered, as if he found her defiance laughable. But just as the officers continued their harsh treatment, something unexpected happened. A figure in the distance noticed the growing commotion. It was a figure who had no intention of standing idly by. As the crowd gathered, watching the scene unfold on the corner of the street, someone among them stood out. Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur known for his radical ideas and outspokenness on social issues, had been flying over the city in his private jet. His assistant had alerted him to the viral video that was already spreading across social media. The footage of Mary being manhandled by the officers had caught his attention, and it was clear to him that something needed to be done. He had been watching from afar, and now he was determined to make a stand. Elon's private jet swooped lower, touching down near the scene, just as the officers began to drag Mary by the arms. The crowd gasped, recognizing the man who had revolutionized space travel and electric cars. As Elon stepped out of his jet, the chaos continued, but something about his presence shifted the atmosphere. The crowd began to murmur in disbelief. What was he doing here? "Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from," a voice echoed through the crowd, cutting through the tension. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Elon had seen enough. And now, the wheels of change were about to turn in ways no one had ever imagined. Mary Johnson had always been a woman of quiet strength, a force of nature shaped by years of hardship, love, and resilience. Born and raised in the segregated South, she knew what it meant to fight for dignity before she even understood the concept of justice. Her childhood was filled with the bitter sting of racism, and her adult life had been no different. Yet, in all the years that had passed, she had never let that hatred break her. Growing up in a small town in Alabama, Mary was no stranger to the harsh realities of the world around her. Her parents, who had come from humble beginnings, worked tirelessly to provide for their children. Mary, the eldest of 5, often helped around the house and took on a lot of responsibility. But despite the constant strain, she had always excelled in school. She had a gift for science, a mind that was curious and always asking questions, seeking answers in a world that offered few. Her high school years were marked by both achievement and struggle. She was one of the few black students at her school, and as the civil rights movement began to take shape in the late 60s, Mary found herself at the forefront of change in her community. She attended protests and marches, standing side by side with others who were tired of being treated like second-class citizens. But it was a difficult road. Her participation earned her a great deal of animosity from both the town's white residents and some of her own. The threat of violence was constant, but Mary never wavered. It was during those turbulent years that she met Thomas Johnson, the love of her life. Thomas, a man with deep convictions, shared her passion for justice. He was the kind of man who believed in fighting not just for his own rights, but for the rights of others. They married young, and together they raised 2 children, David and Lisa. But life was never easy, and Thomas's career as a truck driver took him across the country, leaving Mary to balance the responsibilities of raising 2 children while working as a nurse. The late nights at the hospital were exhausting, but they didn't deter Mary. She took pride in her work, knowing that she was making a difference in the lives of those who needed it most. Over the years, she developed a reputation as a compassionate, caring nurse who never hesitated to advocate for her patients. Her colleagues respected her, and her patients trusted her. Yet, despite the satisfaction she found in her work, it wasn't enough to shield her from the weight of systemic racism that was present in every corner of her life. Mary's most painful memory, however, was the loss of her husband, Thomas, to cancer when she was just 50. It was a devastating blow, one that left her heartbroken and adrift. But she was no stranger to overcoming obstacles. After the funeral, she focused on raising her children, now adults, with the same values she had fought for her whole life: integrity, resilience, and the belief that justice was worth pursuing, no matter the cost. As time went on, Mary became increasingly vocal about the racial injustices that continued to plague her community. She volunteered with local organizations and spoke at rallies, using her voice to advocate for change. Her son, David, who had become a lawyer, joined her efforts, and together, they made a powerful team. But it wasn't just her family who admired Mary's strength. Over the years, she had become a pillar in her community, respected by neighbors, friends, and even strangers who crossed her path. On the surface, Mary's life might have seemed ordinary, like that of any older woman living alone in a small apartment. But to those who knew her, she was anything but ordinary. She had survived and thrived through every hardship, every setback, and every injustice thrown her way. She had learned that the world didn't always give you a fair chance, but that didn't mean you had to accept its cruelty. And now, as she walked down that same street where, just moments ago, she had been attacked by 2 police officers, Mary was no stranger to the feeling of injustice. But there was something different about this moment. It wasn't just the usual fight for survival or dignity. This time, someone was watching. Someone powerful. Someone who could make a real difference. As she lay on the cold pavement, still feeling the sting of the officer's shove, Mary's mind raced. But she held on to one truth that had served her entire life. This fight wasn't over yet. If anything, it was just beginning. The crowd had begun to grow, a mixture of onlookers, curious bystanders, and those with their phones out, recording every moment of the escalating chaos. Mary lay on the pavement, bruised but not beaten, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her heart was racing, not from fear, but from the deep, all too familiar anger that churned inside her. She had seen this before. She had witnessed her people being brutalized, and now it was her turn. But unlike before, today felt different. People were starting to murmur, a few voices rising above the rest. Did you see that? They just threw her down like she was nothing. She didn't even do anything. This is messed up. You should call the cops on the cops. But no one moved. No one dared to step forward. The officers, clearly unfazed by the crowd that had gathered, continued to tower over Mary. One of them, the taller of the 2, shouted down at her. "You stay down. We don't need any more trouble from you." Mary's breath quickened as the sharp pain in her arm intensified. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Not today. Just as the situation reached its boiling point, David, her son, arrived on the scene. He had been on the phone with his mother when he first heard the commotion. His heart had dropped when he heard the distress in her voice, and now, seeing her on the ground, he was consumed by an overwhelming rush of emotions. Rage, fear, helplessness. He wanted to run to her, scoop her up, and take her away from this nightmare, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. David's jaw clenched as he approached the scene. His eyes locked on the officers. The crowd parted as he pushed through, his presence commanding attention. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice firm, cutting through the tension like a knife. The officer who had shoved Mary turned his gaze toward David. "This is none of your business. She's being arrested for disturbing the peace," he said, his voice laced with authority, though it held no truth. David's eyes widened in disbelief. "Disturbing the peace? She's not doing anything. You're the ones causing a scene." The second officer, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward with an almost smug look on his face. "You need to back off before you get involved in something you won't be able to handle." David's blood boiled. He had seen his mother endure injustice for years, but this was different. This was his mother, a woman who had raised him to be strong, to never back down from a fight, even when it seemed impossible. The officer's words felt like a slap in the face, not just to him but to everything his mother had stood for. As the confrontation continued, a loud buzzing noise filled the air. David froze, confused for a moment, until he realized it was the sound of a helicopter approaching. The crowd began to murmur again, some people speculating it was news coverage, others thinking it was another police helicopter. But what they didn't expect was the sleek, silver jet that appeared in the sky, descending lower and lower until it touched down on the open patch of grass nearby, the sound of the engines roaring through the tense air. The crowd went silent. Out of the jet stepped none other than Elon Musk himself. It was as if the world had paused. People stared, their mouths hanging open. Why was he here? What did he have to do with this? David looked at the billionaire entrepreneur with confusion and disbelief. But there was something in Elon's face that struck him, a look of determination, as if he had been sent here for a reason. Elon didn't waste a second. He approached the scene, his steps purposeful, his eyes locking onto the officers. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but commanding. The officers, who had been accustomed to having the upper hand, now seemed uncertain. They exchanged a quick glance, clearly thrown off by Elon's unexpected presence. "This woman is being disruptive," the first officer said, his words clearly rehearsed, but now they sounded hollow. Elon turned to the crowd and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Is this the kind of behavior we allow in our communities? Is this what we stand for?" His voice carried, and for the first time, the crowd began to murmur in agreement. The weight of his words was not lost on anyone. He had power. He had influence. And he was using it to make a stand for what was right. David, still standing off to the side, watched as Elon spoke with the officers. This wasn't what he had expected. Was this some kind of publicity stunt? A random act of kindness from a billionaire who didn't know the first thing about the realities his mother had lived through? Or was there something deeper here? Elon turned his gaze to David, his eyes softening. "Is this your mother?" he asked. David nodded, still trying to process the surreal scene unfolding before him. "I'm going to make sure she gets the justice she deserves," Elon said, his voice firm. The words hit David like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about the confrontation anymore. This was something much bigger. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. A voice echoed from the crowd as more people began filming, their phones raised high to capture this unexpected moment in history. Elon Musk had just entered the fight, and no one knew how it would all unfold. But one thing was for sure. Things were about to change in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The tension in the air felt like it was thick enough to slice through. The officers stood frozen, caught off guard by Elon Musk's unexpected arrival. For a moment, Everything was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of the helicopter blades slowly fading into the background. The crowd, now thick with anticipation, held its breath. No one knew how this would end, but they all sensed that it was no longer just about Mary. It had become something bigger, something larger than any of them. Mary, still on the ground, managed to prop herself up on one elbow. Her face was bruised, her arm aching, but there was something else in her eyes, a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt in years. She had seen so many fights come and go, witnessed so many defeats, but something about this moment made her believe that this fight would be different. Elon turned to face the two officers. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of something more, something that demanded respect. "I'm not going to ask you again," Elon said, his voice steady. "Release this woman. Now." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The power dynamic had shifted. They weren't just facing a black woman in the street anymore. They were facing a global figure who, through his companies and innovations, had made himself a symbol of progress, change, and defiance against the status quo. The taller officer, the one who had initially shoved Mary, straightened his posture. "We're just doing our jobs," he said, his voice shaky now, lacking the conviction it had earlier. "You're abusing your authority," Elon replied, taking a step closer, his eyes never leaving the officers. "You think you're above the law? Well, I'm here to tell you, you're not. And if you don't release her, you'll answer to the public, to the world. And trust me, that's a fight you won't win." The officers remained silent, clearly caught between their duty to enforce the law and the overwhelming force of public opinion. Around them, phones continued to record the moment, capturing every word, every glance. The stakes were higher than ever. David watched this all unfold, his mind racing. He had never imagined that someone like Elon Musk, someone with wealth and power far beyond what his family had ever known, would show up like this. What did he stand to gain from getting involved in a case like his mother's? Was it genuine concern, or was he just seizing a moment to boost his own reputation? But as the minutes ticked by, the answer began to feel clearer. Elon Musk wasn't here for self-promotion. He was here because, like Mary, he had fought against the odds his entire life. He knew what it was like to be underestimated, to be dismissed, and he couldn't stand idly by while someone else was wrongfully treated. After what seemed like an eternity, the second officer, the quieter one, suddenly took a step back, his hand falling to his side. His partner, however, still wasn't convinced. "You don't know what you're dealing with here," the officer growled, his grip on Mary's arm tightening. Elon's eyes hardened. "I think you're the one who doesn't understand what's at stake." He turned to the crowd, which had now grown even larger, some people stepping forward, eager to witness what would happen next. "You all see this, don't you? This is what happens when power is abused. And if we don't stand up for what's right, we're all complicit." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some began shouting in support of Elon's words, while others continued filming. But the officer, still hesitant, seemed to be breaking. His grip loosened on Mary's arm, and for the first time, he glanced at his partner for guidance. His partner's gaze faltered, and slowly, almost reluctantly, the two officers stepped back. Elon turned to David, who had been silently watching the scene unfold. "Is she okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, an expression of genuine concern on his face. David nodded slowly, still in shock. "She will be," he said, though his voice cracked. "But we need to make sure this doesn't happen again." Mary, with David's help, finally managed to get to her feet. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but her spirit remained unbroken. She locked eyes with Elon, gratitude and disbelief mixing in her gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know who else would step in." Elon gave her a reassuring smile. "It's not just me," he replied. "It's all of us. And we're not backing down." The crowd, once tense and uncertain, now erupted into applause. The officers, now fully aware that they had been outmatched, backed away, retreating to their squad car. No one said anything to them as they left, but their silence spoke volumes. The message was clear. This kind of abuse wouldn't be tolerated any longer. As the officers drove off, Elon turned to Mary and David once more. "You have my word," he said. "I'll make sure this gets the attention it deserves. And I'll make sure your story is heard. No one should ever have to experience what you just did." Mary smiled, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of hope, of possibility. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. The helicopter buzzed overhead again, the sound now more distant, but its presence still loomed large in the background. Elon Musk had made his mark, and the story of what had just transpired would spread like wildfire. The world was watching, and it wasn't just about Mary anymore. It was about all of us. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. The voice echoed through the crowd again. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Mary glanced at her son, a quiet determination in her eyes. "What pushes me forward," she whispered, "is knowing that even in the darkest times, change is possible. And I'll be here, fighting for it, every step of the way." The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the energy in the air remained electric, crackling with the tension of what had just unfolded. The police officers were gone, and so was the helicopter. Yet, there was something else lingering, a palpable shift in the atmosphere, as if a tipping point had been reached. For Mary, it was as though time had slowed down. She stood on shaky legs, still processing what had just happened. She had lived through so much, seen too many injustices that had gone unnoticed, too many cries for help that had been ignored. But today, she felt something different. She felt seen. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she mattered. Like the battle she had fought her whole life wasn't in vain. David stood by her side, his hand on her shoulder, offering quiet support. He could see the change in his mother. Her shoulders, which had once been weighed down with the burdens of years of hardship, now seemed to hold a little more strength. The battle wasn't over, but today, for the first time in a long while, it felt like they had won a small victory. Elon Musk, who had remained calm and composed throughout the entire ordeal, now turned to leave, but not before giving Mary a final glance. "I'll be in touch," he said with a firm nod. "This is just the beginning." Mary didn't know what to expect from someone like Elon Musk. He wasn't a stranger to controversy, but seeing him intervene so decisively had been a shock. She had never imagined a billionaire, someone so far removed from the everyday struggles she had endured, would step into the fray in such a public, direct way. Was it out of genuine concern, or was it just the media spotlight that had drawn him in? She didn't know, but at that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had shown up when no one else had. The next few days were a whirlwind. News outlets across the country ran the story, but it wasn't just a local issue anymore. The footage of Elon Musk confronting the police officers, standing up for Mary, had gone viral. The story spread like wildfire, with headlines proclaiming, "Elon Musk steps in to defend black woman from police brutality." But the reaction was far from one-sided. While many praised Elon's actions, calling him a hero, there were also critics who questioned his motivations. Some believed he had simply used the situation to further his own personal agenda, to capitalize on the moment for his own gain. But for every critic, there were dozens of others who pointed out that his actions had spoken louder than words ever could. It wasn't about his wealth or status. It was about the fact that he had used his platform to make a stand. Mary didn't care about the debate. She didn't care what the media said about Elon's motivations. What mattered to her was that, for the first time in years, she felt like something could change. She could feel it in the way people spoke about the incident, how the conversation around police brutality and racial injustice seemed to be shifting. This time, it wasn't just a momentary outrage. People were demanding real change. One evening, a few days after the incident, Mary received a call from Elon's office. It was a simple message: "Elon Musk would like to meet with you." Her heart skipped a beat. Was this really happening? What could he possibly want from her? A small part of her was skeptical, but a much larger part of her felt a rising sense of excitement. This could be the moment that changed everything. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Mary tried to prepare herself, but she couldn't stop thinking about the many times in her life when opportunities had slipped through her fingers. She had worked hard for so long, pushing through pain and adversity, But had anyone ever really listened? Had anyone ever truly cared about her, or the stories of people like her? Elon Musk's private jet was waiting at a small airport near her home. She was accompanied by David, who had insisted on coming along. They were flown to a state-of-the-art conference center, where Elon was already waiting. The setting felt surreal, like a dream that was too big to process all at once. When they walked into the room, Elon greeted them warmly, his handshake firm but not overpowering. He was no longer the distant billionaire, the faceless figure of headlines and social media posts. In that moment, he seemed human, grounded, real. "I'm glad you're here," Elon said, gesturing for them to sit down. "I know you've been through a lot, Mary, and I've been thinking about what happened, about how we can work together to make sure something like this never happens again." Mary's heart raced, but she steadied herself. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice cautious. Elon leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. "I've been looking at the bigger picture, the systemic issues that contribute to the kind of violence we saw in that moment. It's not just about one incident. It's about a much deeper, ingrained problem that needs to be addressed. I want to help you make sure that your story and the stories of so many others are heard, and that the systems that allow this kind of abuse to happen are dismantled." David, who had been quiet up until now, looked at Elon, his eyes narrowed. "What are you really offering here?" he asked. Elon smiled slightly. "Not just money, David. I'm talking about using everything at my disposal, my companies, my influence, and most importantly, my platform, to bring about real change. I want to help you create an organization that will stand up against police brutality and systemic racism, one that will work directly with communities and hold those in power accountable." Mary was speechless. The weight of what Elon was proposing was overwhelming. For years, she had been fighting against a system that seemed unshakable. And now, here was someone offering to help her take it down. "This is more than I ever imagined," Mary whispered. "But if you're serious, I'm in. I've spent my whole life fighting for what's right, and I'm not stopping now." Elon nodded. "I believe you. Together, we can make a difference. Let's start this journey, and let's make it count." The room seemed to pulse with energy, as if the very air had shifted. Mary didn't know what the future would hold, but in this moment, surrounded by her son and a man who had, against all odds, stepped into her world, she felt a surge of hope. The fight was far from over, but now, she wasn't fighting alone. The days following the meeting with Elon Musk felt like a whirlwind. Mary had always been a woman of action, never one to sit idly by. But this was different. The plans Elon had proposed were ambitious, radical even, and the idea of collaborating with someone like him, a man who had built an empire, was both thrilling and daunting. But as the dust began to settle, Mary knew that she couldn't back down now. This wasn't just a chance to make a difference. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to create the kind of change that would echo for generations. Elon's commitment wasn't just talk. Over the next several weeks, he and his team worked tirelessly, consulting with community leaders, activists, and legal experts. They focused on a multifaceted approach, not only raising awareness about police brutality and systemic racism, but also pushing for legislative reforms and the creation of community programs designed to foster accountability and transparency within law enforcement. Mary's role in all of this was vital. She had lived through the pain, the struggles, the fear. Her experience gave her the voice that others could relate to, the authenticity that would resonate. Elon understood this better than anyone. He didn't want to be the face of this movement. He wanted Mary to be. "You're the one who has lived this," Elon told her during one of their many strategy sessions. "You're the one who can speak to the people. I'm just here to support you and help you amplify your voice." At first, Mary felt overwhelmed. She had spent so many years fighting for justice on her own, with little to no support, that the idea of being thrust into the spotlight on a global scale was daunting. But with David's encouragement and the support of the team around her, she began to find her footing. Slowly, she started to speak at rallies, sharing her story with anyone who would listen, letting her words reach beyond the streets of her neighborhood and into the homes of millions. The momentum built. Elon's vast social media presence brought even more attention to the cause, and soon, the movement had gone viral. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Mary and hashtag End Police Brutality were trending worldwide. Celebrities, activists, and ordinary people alike were lending their voices to the cause. People from all walks of life were coming together, united by a shared desire to end the systemic violence that had haunted communities of color for so long. But it wasn't just about protests or viral moments. Elon's influence helped push for tangible, legislative change. With his connections, he was able to meet with lawmakers, urging them to pass bills that would hold police officers accountable and implement measures like body cameras, better training, and civilian review boards. Slowly, but surely, the pressure began to build on politicians who had long turned a blind eye to the issue. However, the road was far from smooth. Not everyone was on board with the movement, and the backlash was fierce. There were those who claimed that the focus on police brutality was overblown, that there were other, more pressing issues that needed attention. Some accused Elon of using the cause as a way to distract from his corporate ambitions. But Mary didn't let the critics derail her. She had lived through far worse than criticism, and she knew that the fight for justice was never easy. One evening, as she sat in her apartment, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here, David came to sit beside her. "You've come a long way, Mom," he said, his voice full of admiration. "I can't believe how much has changed in such a short time." Mary smiled, her eyes distant. "I've been waiting for change my entire life, David. But it wasn't until someone like Elon came along that it felt possible. I never thought someone with that much power would care about someone like me." David shook his head. "That's the thing. You didn't need someone like him. You've always had the power within you. You just needed someone to believe in your fight." Mary let out a deep sigh. "I don't know about that. I've fought so long without ever seeing any real progress. But maybe you're right. Maybe it was just about finding the right moment. And maybe that moment is now." Elon's support, however, wasn't the only reason for Mary's growing confidence. The movement had become a symbol of hope for so many, and it was clear that real, lasting change was beginning to take shape. Community programs were being established to rebuild trust between the police and the people, and more cities were adopting new policies aimed at reducing police violence. Even the media, once quick to sensationalize incidents like Mary's, began to approach the issue with more depth and empathy. But even amidst all the victories, Mary couldn't forget what had sparked this change in the first place. The moment she had been attacked by the police, when her dignity, her very existence, had been threatened, was still vivid in her mind. It had been a brutal wake-up call, a reminder of how much work still needed to be done. As the movement continued to grow, so did Mary's sense of purpose. She became a beacon for others who had been silenced by the system, a voice for those who had been forced to suffer in the shadows. Every time she took the stage, spoke at a rally, or shared her story, it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the people who had been unjustly treated, all the lives lost, and all the voices that had been drowned out for far too long. One afternoon, while preparing for another public speech, Mary received a message from Elon's team. They had arranged a meeting with key stakeholders, and they were ready to push for the next phase of their initiative. This would be the moment when everything would come together, the moment they would announce their new partnership, the foundation they had been building behind the scenes, and the major financial commitment they had secured to ensure long-term success. As Mary stood on the stage, looking out at the sea of faces gathered before her, she realized something profound. The fight wasn't just about standing up against the police. It was about standing up for what was right, for dignity, for humanity, and for the belief that, despite all the darkness, change was possible. "Life is unpredictable," she said, her voice steady as it carried across the crowd. "But when we stand together, when we fight together, we become unstoppable. This is just the beginning. And no matter how tough things get, we won't back down." The crowd erupted in applause, and in that moment, Mary knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she had already made history. The road to justice was long, but with each step, they were getting closer. And she was no longer fighting alone. The momentum was undeniable. What had started as a single moment of intervention had exploded into something far greater than Mary or even Elon Musk could have imagined. The hashtag Justice for Mary was everywhere, plastered across billboards, plastered on every social media feed, and even mentioned in some political speeches. It felt like a national conversation had finally ignited, one that centered on race, police brutality, and the power dynamics at play in America. But with every victory came new challenges. Not everyone was on board with the changes that were taking place. The support was not universal, and those who resisted were just as vocal as those who supported it. Mary sat in her office, a small room in a nonprofit building that had just opened under her name. Her eyes were tired. There had been days of rallies, media appearances, and strategy meetings. She'd spoken to lawmakers and community leaders, pouring her heart into every conversation, trying to push for meaningful change. But it was exhausting. The work was only just beginning. David knocked on the door, stepping in with a coffee in hand. "Mom, I thought you might need this." She took the coffee gratefully, her fingers wrapped around the cup for comfort. "Thanks, David. I just can't shake the feeling that we're not making the progress I thought we would." David sat beside her, leaning forward. "You're doing more than anyone else could. People are listening now, and that's the first step. But you've got to understand, change doesn't happen overnight. It's a fight, and it's going to take time." "I know," she sighed, leaning back in her chair. "But it's hard. It's like, no matter how much we do, there's always someone out there ready to tear it all down. The resistance is strong. It's like we're not even in control of the conversation anymore." David's expression grew more serious. "That's because you're up against something bigger than you think. This isn't just about the police. It's about power. It's about an entire system that's been in place for centuries, and it's not going to crumble easily." Mary nodded slowly. "I know, and that's the scary part. It's not just the officers I'm fighting against anymore. It's a culture that protects them, that supports them, no matter what they do." Just as Mary was about to say more, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hesitant but curious, she answered. "Mary," came Elon Musk's familiar voice, calm but with a note of urgency. "We need to talk." Mary sat up straighter. "What's going on, Elon?" There was a pause, and then he spoke again, his tone shifting. "We've been getting pushback. Strong pushback. The people we're up against, there's a lot more money and power behind them than we anticipated. I need to warn you, it's only going to get harder from here." Mary's stomach dropped. "What are you saying? What kind of pushback?" "Media outlets are already starting to turn against us. They're questioning everything, from your story to our motives. Some of them are framing it as an attack on law enforcement, and others are trying to paint you as an opportunist. It's a dangerous narrative, Mary, and we need to figure out how to counter it before it goes any further." She clenched her fists. "I knew it was coming. I knew they wouldn't let us change anything without a fight." "Exactly. And that's why I'm reaching out. We need to make sure we're prepared. This isn't just about getting people to listen anymore. It's about fighting back against the machine." Mary's mind raced. She had been on the defensive for so long, fighting against the system, fighting for justice. But now, this felt different. Now, they were at war. "We need to control the narrative," Elon continued. "We need to get in front of this and take the fight to them, not just react. I have some ideas, but we need to act fast." Mary nodded, her eyes steely with determination. "I'm ready. Let's do it. But we need to make sure we stay true to the cause. No matter what happens." Elon's voice softened. "We will. Trust me, Mary. I'm with you every step of the way." The call ended, and Mary sat in silence for a moment. David watched her, knowing that the weight of the conversation had hit her hard. "What now?" he asked, sensing the shift in the air. "We prepare," she said, her voice resolute. "If they think we're just going to back down, they're wrong. We've already come this far, and there's no turning back now." The next few days were a blur of meetings, late-night brainstorming sessions, and strategy talks with Elon's team. They decided to launch a counter-campaign, a direct response to the media's narrative. The focus would shift away from their personal attacks and put the spotlight back on the real issue: systemic injustice and how to fix it. They planned press conferences, social media campaigns, and outreach efforts aimed at amplifying the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. Mary stood firm, despite the pressure mounting from all sides. Every day, new stories surfaced, aiming to undermine her efforts. There were whispers in political circles about the dangerous influence of tech billionaires like Elon Musk, and there were accusations that the movement was a mere distraction from real, pressing national issues. Mary couldn't ignore the noise, but she refused to let it break her spirit. With each challenge came more supporters, more people joining the cause, more voices demanding change. Slowly, she realized that this wasn't just her fight anymore. It was the fight of countless others who had lived with the same pain, the same anger, and the same desire for justice. The fight was growing, and the resistance was fierce, but so was the movement. As the weeks went on, a sense of unity began to take root. The opposition could no longer deny the truth. People were waking up, not just in the streets, but in their homes, their workplaces, their schools. The movement was becoming a force to be reckoned with, and it was only getting stronger. But just as things seemed to be shifting in their favor, a new, unexpected threat appeared. Mary had always known that the road to justice would be full of hurdles, but the weight of the new threat she was facing was heavier than anything she had encountered before. Despite the strength of the movement and the growing number of supporters, someone with considerable influence, was starting to push back in a way that couldn't be ignored. It started with subtle attacks. Anonymous social media accounts began posting false narratives about Mary's past, accusing her of being part of radical groups and claiming that she was using the cause to gain personal fame and fortune. At first, Mary tried to dismiss it, but the smear campaigns only grew louder. Soon, the attacks expanded to Elon Musk, questioning his motives and framing his involvement as nothing more than a PR stunt to distract from the controversies surrounding his other business ventures. One night, after an exhausting day of meetings, Mary sat in her office, staring at her laptop. The new post she had just read, another accusation against her, was sitting like a heavy weight on her chest. For the first time in a long while, doubt crept into her mind. Could this be the beginning of the end? Had everything she and Elon worked for really been a pipe dream? David walked in, sensing the tension in the air. "Mom, you okay?" Mary rubbed her eyes, trying to push the exhaustion away. "I'm trying to keep it together, but it feels like we're fighting a battle on every front now." David sat beside her, glancing at the screen. "We knew it wouldn't be easy, but we've come this far, right? People are starting to see the truth." Mary nodded, but there was still that gnawing feeling in her gut, the fear that no matter how much they achieved, the forces aligned against them were relentless. "I don't know, David. The hate we're getting is growing, and it's not just online anymore. I'm hearing rumors that certain politicians and powerful figures are meeting behind closed doors to figure out how to shut this movement down." David's face darkened. "This isn't just about them trying to beat you anymore. This is about stopping something bigger, something they can't control. We're making real progress, and the people who've been in power for so long don't like that." Mary sat back in her chair, the weight of it all sinking in. She had always been the underdog, the woman who fought for justice, often alone. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for an entire movement, for the countless lives that had been affected by systemic violence. Elon called just then, his voice sharp with urgency. "Mary, we need to talk. The situation's escalating. I'm hearing whispers from people who are trying to take us down, by any means necessary." "What do you mean?" Mary asked, her pulse quickening. "I don't want to alarm you, but I've been getting some pretty alarming intel. There's talk of discrediting the movement even further. If it gets to the right people, they could start pushing laws to limit your ability to speak out. And there's something worse. There's speculation that they might use force to stop us." Mary's blood ran cold. "You're telling me they're going to try to shut us down? I don't know how far they'll go, but we have to prepare for the worst. I'm doing everything I can on my end to push back, but we need a strategic plan. I need you to be ready for anything." Mary took a deep breath. She couldn't back down, not now. "I'll be ready, but you're right. We need to be strategic. I can't let them crush this movement without a fight." As the conversation ended, Mary felt a mixture of anger and fear. They had already come so far, and now, it seemed like the opposition was willing to do anything to stop them. But Mary wasn't just anyone. She had already faced worse and overcome it. If this was the challenge that lay ahead, she would meet it head-on. The days that followed were intense. The pressure mounted with each passing moment, and the whispers of conspiracy became harder to ignore. Elon kept pushing forward on his end, using his resources to amplify the cause even more, while Mary focused on the next phase of the movement, preparing for a possible showdown. They met with legal experts, strategists, and security teams, planning out every possible scenario. Mary knew that no matter what, they couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Their mission wasn't just to fight for justice. It was to ensure that the movement would survive in the face of adversity. The forces behind the opposition were larger than they had anticipated, and it was clear that they would stop at nothing to maintain control. Despite the overwhelming odds, something strange began to happen. More and more people from different walks of life started reaching out to show their support. Ordinary citizens who had remained silent up until now were beginning to speak out. Teachers, doctors, even police officers who had grown disillusioned with the system began to publicly back the movement, risking their own careers in the process. One day, while Mary was addressing a group of activists, a man approached her after the speech. He was in his late 30s, dressed in a simple suit, and his eyes held a mix of determination and fear. "I've been watching everything unfold," he said quietly, his voice tinged with urgency. "I can't stand by any longer. You're right. This movement is about more than just police brutality. It's about the future of this country, and I'm in a position to help." Mary eyed him cautiously, unsure of his intentions. "Who are you?" "My name's James. I've been working in politics for years, but the more I see, the more I realize we're heading down a dangerous path. I can help you. I can get you the legal support and influence you need to protect this movement." Mary felt a rush of skepticism, but also something else, hope. "What's the catch?" James smiled faintly. "No catch, just a desire to see real change. You're doing something that's bigger than politics. I want to be a part of that." Mary studied him for a moment. Could this be the breakthrough they needed? The walls were closing in, but James was offering a way through, if she could trust him. The stakes had never been higher. Everything that Mary and Elon had fought for, everything they had sacrificed, was now hanging by a thread. The forces working against them had become more aggressive, but in the midst of the storm, Mary had something that they didn't: the unwavering support of the people and the courage to stand up when everything seemed to be crumbling. It was time for a final push. The truth had come to light. The narrative about Mary's so-called radical agenda was falling apart, but the opposition was growing desperate. New laws aimed at silencing protests had been drafted. Public figures were being pressured to denounce the movement. And there were rumors, frightening rumors, of actions that would be taken against those at the very top of the movement. Elon and his team had already moved into full defense mode. Legal teams worked around the clock, counteracting the slander, and ensuring their legal right to assemble and speak wasn't infringed upon. But Mary knew, deep down, that it wasn't just about the law. This fight wasn't only for legal justice, it was for the soul of a nation. One evening, as Mary sat in her office going through documents, she received a call from James. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of urgency. "Mary, I think it's time. We have the support we need. The politicians we've been working with are ready to make their move." Mary's heart raced. "Are you sure? After everything we've been through, are they really willing to take a stand?" "I've been talking to them. They see the truth now. The people aren't backing down, and neither should they. This is our chance to push for real change, once and for all." Mary sat up straighter. For months, she had felt the crushing weight of resistance, but now, finally, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. "Let's do it. But this time, we do it big. We don't just fight to be heard. We fight to change everything." The next few days were a blur of strategy meetings, speeches, and press releases. They mobilized supporters across the country, organizing large rallies, peaceful protests, and press conferences. They called on community leaders, influencers, and activists to lend their voices to the cause. The country was watching, and they were ready to make a statement. Then came the day of the massive national rally in Washington, D.C. It was going to be the largest event the movement had ever organized. Thousands of people gathered, filling the streets in a sea of signs, chants, and unwavering determination. The media buzzed with anticipation, cameras capturing every moment, Every sign that read, "Justice for Mary," "Justice for all," "End police brutality," and "We are the change." Mary stood backstage, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment. This was what they had worked for. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been pushed down, everyone who had been hurt by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Elon stood beside her, offering her a reassuring smile. "You're ready. This is your time." Mary took a deep breath. She had been through so much already, but it was all leading up to this. She walked to the podium, her legs feeling like lead but her spirit unbreakable. As she stepped up to the microphone, the crowd roared in approval, the noise deafening, but Mary's voice cut through it all. "This is bigger than any of us," she began, her voice strong, steady. "This movement is not just about one woman, one tragedy, or one story. This is about all of us. It's about the countless lives that have been stolen by hate, by fear, and by a broken system. It's about our children, our families, and our future. It's about making sure that no one, no matter their skin color, their background, or their circumstances, ever has to live in fear again." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Mary held up her hand, signaling for silence. "We're not asking for change, we're demanding it. We will not rest, and we will not be silenced until justice is served. This fight is not just mine, it's ours. And together, we will make history. We will make sure that our voices are heard, and that we create a world where everyone, every single person, can live with dignity, with respect, and with the right to be free." The roar of the crowd was deafening. It wasn't just a chant, it was a movement. The sound of thousands of people united, their voices echoing with one clear message. Change was coming, and nothing could stop it now. Over the next few weeks, the movement gained unprecedented momentum. The politicians who had been hesitant to take a stand were now publicly endorsing the cause, promising to push for real policy changes to address systemic racism and police brutality. Laws were being drafted to ensure accountability within law enforcement agencies. And perhaps most importantly, the conversation in the media shifted. No longer was the story about Mary or Elon or the challenges they faced. It was about the people, the movement, and the undeniable truth of what needed to change. Mary sat down with her family that evening, reflecting on the journey they had all been through. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, pain, and fear. But there had also been moments of hope, of unity, and of incredible strength. "I didn't think we'd make it this far," she said softly, looking around at David, Elon, and the rest of her team. "You did," Elon said with a smile. "You led this. You brought us together. You gave us a voice when we had none." Mary smiled, her heart full. "No, we did it together. This was never about me. It was about all of us." In the months that followed, real change began to take root. There was still much work to be done, but the world was different now. People had stood up and refused to accept a broken system. They had fought, they had marched, they had raised their voices, and they had made a difference. And as Mary looked out over the horizon, she knew that the journey wasn't over. But it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where justice and equality weren't just ideals, but realities. And she was proud to have been a part of that change.